407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a general battlefield of that war. We are met to dedicate a portion of it as the final resting place of those here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work that they have thus far so nobly carried on. It is rather for us here to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Welcome to We the People. We're very proud to have an audience of this size for We the People Healing Our Democracy, and we thank you on behalf of my colleagues for showing up today for this very important discussion. 161 years ago, in less than 2 minutes and 272 words, Abraham Lincoln challenged this nation to hold its core values of democracy and freedom. Even though this country had many problems, Lincoln was convinced that they could hold on to these core principal values. And he asked the country to fight as hard as it could to keep them, knowing that they were necessary to keep this government of the people, by the people, for the people intact. A show of hands. How many of you are concerned about the state of our democracy today? Oh, only a few. How many of you are worried about losing some basic freedoms? How many of you believe that social media has the capability of interfering? Don't have to finish the question, okay? Let me ask you one other question or bring out one other point. This is the United States. Why is it that this country has this global magnetic appeal? Why is it that so many people around the world want to come to America to become Americans? Why is that? I'm looking for hands. Why is that? Raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone. Okay. Go ahead. Why fear? Freedom. Okay. Okay, all right. Say it again. Opportunities, freedom, opportunities. Anybody else? Say it again. Okay, all right. One more. Big voice. Refuge. Democracy. Okay, all right, excellent. All right. These are the kinds of questions and issues and answers that we want to discuss today at this important event. And again, we thank you so much for showing up. This is an impressive crowd on a beautiful day, and we want to have this kind of a discussion. Not in the dark, not in bedrooms, not in strolling through hateful messages on computer screens. We want to have this conversation out in the open, in the public square, where we are now. If the motto on the masthead of the Washington Post is accurate, that democracy dies in darkness, maybe just the opposite is also accurate, that democracy thrives in daylight. And that's where we are now, in the daylight, in the public square. And that's an important place for all of us to be right now. And this is the kind of conversation that we want to have and the kind of discussion that we want to have for however long you want to stay here. And at this point, I am going to let you know that we have 4 panelists, each of whom kind of represent a different slice of the political spectrum. And we have a terrific moderator who is going to quarterback this operation. And her name is Charlene Behrens, who you see sitting here.
Thank you.
Dr. Behrens to some of her former students I see are in the audience. She is a professor emeritus of the University of Nebraska Lincoln College of Journalism. She is a political junkie. She is a recognized authority on the state government of Nebraska, and specifically the unicameral, having written a book about the unicameral that is the definitive work on that institution. So Dr. Behrens is going to take it over from here, and the way this is going to work, she'll explain the way this is going to work. And we will have microphones, and we will get you them as soon as you have something to say. So for right now, let's give it up for Dr. Behrens, our moderator for today.
Laura? Thank you, Joe. And thanks for the rounds of applause. It's always nice to get your applause before you say anything. Safer that way. And I'm looking out and I do see a bunch of former students, and it's just fantastic to see you. And I've met some parents of former students, which is also good. But enough about that. Here, before we start, just a few details about how this is going to go. We want this to be a conversation. We want you to have a chance to say what's on your mind, to ask questions of the panelists and each other. And so we're going to, I'll ask a few questions to the panelists. They have the questions ahead of time, and we'll hear them respond. And then we'll take questions from you to them and to each other. Just remember, please, to be brief. We want to have a lot of people have an opportunity to speak. And if you want to continue the conversation after we end the program, the panelists have agreed to stay for a while afterwards and talk with you one-on-one in the chapel, which is just around the corner to the east from the main door back there. We know that there are a lot of points of view represented here on the panel and in the audience. And we're looking forward to a discussion that's conducted in a spirit of openness, but also of kindness and respect for each other and for each other's ideas. Now, let me introduce our panelists, please. To my immediate left is Laura Ebke, a native Nebraskan who served in the Nebraska legislature from 2015 to 2019. Before that, she was an elected member of the Crete School Board for 12 years. She's a senior fellow at the Platt Institute, a state policy think tank focusing on economic freedom. She holds a PhD in political science. And she and her husband, Russ, have 3 grown children and 1 grandchild. They've lived in Crete since 1995. Next to her is Senator Danielle Conrad, a civil rights attorney who was elected to the Nebraska legislature in 2006 and 2010. And during those first 2 terms of service, she served as a member of the Appropriations Committee. Thanks to term limits, she sat out a few years. She was reelected in 2022 and is now a member of the Education Committee, Government Military Affairs, and Retirement Systems Committees. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UNL and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Nebraska College of Law. She lives in the East Campus neighborhood in North Lincoln with her husband and 2 children. Excuse me. To her left is the Reverend Jim Keck, senior pastor here at First-Plymouth Church. He was ordained in 1990 in Newport Beach, California, and served churches in California and Massachusetts before coming to Lincoln 19 years ago. He holds a doctoral degree from Andover Newton Seminary, and he is married to Becca, who is a psychotherapist for the Lincoln Public Schools. And way at the end down there is Brian Bresnahan, who grew up in Plattsmouth. He graduated from UNL with a degree in natural resources and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. He was deployed twice in support of operations in Somalia and Bosnia, and later to Al-Anbar province in Iraq. After completing his active duty, he returned to Nebraska and began a career as an agronomist. In 2009, he started his own crop consulting firm, working with farmers across central Nebraska. Brian and his wife live near Central City. We are really honored that all 4 of these people are here with us today. So, our first question today is, and each of them will answer this in turn, and then they can play off of each other a little bit if they'd like. How did you develop your political views? Was it your family? Or if not, who was it? How did it happen? And have you ever changed your political views? And we're just going to start right here with Laura and work our way down the line.
Okay, I think it's on. Well, like most people, I think, I kind of developed my core political views at home in my family. My folks certainly had an impact on the way I approach things. But I think that, as with most people, our life's experiences, time, changes our political views. So yes, I have changed my political views on some things. I think most people probably have. And it also changes the way you look at some things over time. It's something that my parents taught me, is to always question things and always to ask, not get stuck in a particular dogma. So I think that that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Good afternoon, beautiful neighbors. Hi, I'm Danielle Conrad. Thank you so much to Joe and to First-Plymouth for the foresight to organize this important forum and for their hospitality and welcoming everyone every day, but particularly today. It's really exciting to share space with this incredible group of panelists, and many of you who know me, and I see so many good friends in the audience, know that I got my start in politics, that political spark very, very early in life. I won't go into the full story, but I was in about 4th grade when I was watching Mel Maines interview Kay Orr and Helen Busalis, and it was that lightning bolt moment, just came right through 1011 to my parents' kitchen table, and I knew that I wanted to somehow be a part of what those 2 incredible women were doing. And I came to Lincoln and visited Helen's campaign headquarters, and then went back home to Seward and volunteered on the campaign. She was ultimately not successful, but we had Helen Busalis Day after a chance meeting out at my country school in Seward, or in Staplehurst. And the whole school came together, and we talked about government and politics and public service. And from that point forward, she became my friend and my mentor, and we wrote letters back and forth for decades. She was with me when I kicked off my first campaign for the legislature, and still is always present in my head and in my heart. So that was really the inspiration inspiration and the spark that led me on a path to public service. And I know Helen was that inspiration for many people in our community and our state as well.
Let me first ask, as a minister, when I see full pews, are we passing the collection plate? So, when I was a young boy, my father was president of the Des Moines School Board, and it was during desegregation of the schools, and I was bused to an all-black school across town, and we were getting bomb threats at the house, and then it even got worse when he tried to do sex education in the schools. And so I think in America, there's a red path and a blue path, essentially, and they're made up of a number of traits, but that red path is something like wanting less government, less regulations, less immigration, or emphasis on individual responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. And then, the blue path that imagines government programs can really serve the poor and focusing maybe on individual rights, et cetera. There's this red path, blue path. But have your views changed through life is the part of that question I'm hearing, because I certainly grew up in what might be called the blue path. But then, and that continued when I went to graduate school in Berkeley, and I was all in on Berkeley, and Berkeley has kind of a blue path. Did you know that? And then, though, the first church I served was in Newport Beach, Orange County, and there was not a single Democrat in the congregation, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. And so I went that experience from living deeply immersed in each path. And in fact, I did find my views changing and moderating and becoming a little more nuanced and dichotomous almost at times.
I'm surprised that everybody's just sitting in the front in church. It's the first time you ever see that, right? Yeah, right. So my family didn't actually even talk about politics. It just wasn't a thing for us. It was sports, it was hunting, fishing, football, work, family. I don't actually remember my parents ever even talking about politics. I think I remember my grandpa talking to a couple guys one time about it. So it really wasn't a thing growing up. When I turned 18, could register to vote, I actually registered as a Democrat because I had an uncle who was running for county commissioner as a Democrat, and I could vote for him in the primary. Was that was fair, but I didn't really know anything about politics. Go to college, you are kind of forced to learn about politics, especially when you're in the military, and you start learning national security policy and those sorts of things. And I figured out that my views aligned more with the Republicans at the time, especially when I got my first paycheck and saw all my taxes flying out the window, and I'm working 40 hours a week trying to pay my own way through college. So that led me to re-register as a Republican. And then, you go to the Marine Corps and you travel the world and go to different wars and start your own business, have your own kids, run for, serve a couple of terms on the school board. All those sorts of things kind of led me to where I was politically. And how I got here is because Joe asked 10 other people that were Trump voters to come do this, and they wouldn't do it. I think he said they yelled at him or wouldn't even talk to him. So, but here I am.
Okay. So we've established, I think, that there's generally a red path and a blue path. We could probably all recognize that. Do you think, though, friends, are there some values that most Americans share, some beliefs that most Americans share? And whoever would like to speak first, please do.
Are there values or beliefs, you said?
Either one.
Okay. I'm in a unique position of being the minister on the panel, so let me say what I actually think we share is what I would call a type of spirituality. As human beings, we're strivers. We're striving for something higher and better. We need goals, and we share what we love. We love friends and family and country, and we're seeking to grow in that love, and I think we share a lot of values. So when I mean spiritual, I mean in that largest sense of the human common good.
Anybody else? I'd like to hear from more.
Well, oops, sorry, turn it off. Well, sure. I think that everybody in this room probably shares a lot of the the common ideals of, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all that sort of thing. I also think that that Reverend Keck is correct. That Jim is correct. That we have, there's a certain, spirituality, something inbred in us where we need connection with folks. And I think that's something that's important. We all want the connection. The question is, how do we make that connection? The difficulty is oftentimes in figuring out, not the end goal, but the means to the end. And that's where we find our disputes. And I think that, we can talk about this later maybe, but I think that's where we run into problems in our political discourses, that we forget that we all have kind of common wants, needs, goals, and it's just a matter of how to get there that we disagree with. And so if we assume the best of all, then maybe we can move forth.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I know Senator Ebke shares a similar experience to mine, having served in our beautiful nonpartisan unicameral legislature, where we work every day across the aisle. There is no aisle from a partisan perspective, with representatives from communities very different than our own, who have ideas very different than our own. And it is a reflection of what happens in each of our daily lives, where we connect with family members, neighbors, people at our places of business, and we figure out how to solve challenges in front of us, and we figure out where the common ground might be, and we hold on to that, and we build on that, and when we have disagreements, we figure out a way to stay in relationship through those disagreements, because you never know what the next challenge might be before us. But I think Laura is exactly right. For the most part, do we share a lot of the same values and beliefs? Yes, I think we do. Visiting with neighbors who have a different party registration than mine, serving with colleagues that have very different viewpoints than mine in terms of where they fall on the political spectrum. We do basically want the same things: good schools, safe communities, strong families, opportunity, freedom, liberty. But I think where our disagreements do lie are in terms of either what we prioritize or the solutions attendant to effectuating those values through our political means and otherwise. And so keeping that in mind when we're in the midst of, complex and controversial and challenging debates, whether that's over the kitchen table or in the halls of government, the folks that are holding those other points of view and in that debate are holding those points of view authentically and meaningfully, and have thought deeply in many regards about how they're trying to advance those shared values. And I always try to keep that in my head and in my heart when we're in the middle of those really challenging conversations or debates, because it helps to recognize each other's humanity, it helps to clarify where the common ground does exist, and then it helps us to stay in relationship for that next issue where our politics might align in a different way, where we find more alliances which can be powerful and meaningful.
Thank you. And Brian?
I think most people are good people, just plain and simple. I've been a lot of places in the world, and everywhere I go, I kind of see the same thing out of everybody, that they're just generally good people that are more than willing to help each other out, would rather get along than not. Even if you've got a neighbor you don't like, if they needed help, you'd help them. It's kind of that simple in my mind. And I think most of us would rather be sitting around having coffee or a beer or some bourbon instead of, arguing and fighting about politics, because we would rather just get along and figure things out rather than have the thing that we see going on in the world, in the nation, even in our local communities now. And I think that if we keep focused on that, I think that's really going to pay dividends, because that is definitely a common thread that I see across the board.
Okay, so we've established that we share a lot of principles and a lot of values and a lot of beliefs, but we also have to say that there are lots of issues on which we are very, very divided. Are there any of those that you can think of where we could agree to disagree in order to get along as Americans?
Well, I don't know if I want to go first because I'm going to wade into some dangerous waters, but this is a safe ethic here. An issue that Americans should agree to disagree on. So abortion has played major roles in our political campaigns now for decades. And as a theologian, I, in essence, specialize in metaphysics. And the abortion argument is deeply metaphysical. And arguments aren't easily won in that realm, particularly when there's a metaphysical distinction between how someone would see when does human life begin, and so to take a metaphysical assertion that that human life has begun versus, say, women's rights and individual rights, that's an argument that's forever fraught. And so I have no route to this solution, but I would wish that we would realize that will never be resolved. That metaphysical decision will never be resolved. So that I have no answer. You go.
Well, the lens you're applying is far beyond my pay grade. So, but I can tell you from taking up those very controversial issues in the halls of power, again, it goes back to the recognition that people who hold a different viewpoint than my own hold it authentically. And they argue passionately for that deeply held position that is very true to them and to their constituents and to their communities. And our state and our nation is very closely divided on this topic, right? We just have evidence from the most recent election right here in Nebraska where we saw a very, very closely divided point of view amongst Nebraskans about some of these most complex and controversial issues. But another thing that I think is important to keep in mind while we don't sacrifice our values and our principles and our approach, no matter where we fall in regards to reproductive rights and reproductive freedom, is that there's still common ground. There's still common ground possible. Say, for example, we have been able to find opportunities to work together in the legislature with pro-choice senators and pro-life senators to say, we all agree that people should have healthy moms and healthy babies and more access to prenatal care and more opportunities to be able to get support for early in life, regardless of where somebody might fall on access to abortion care, for example. And that helps to bridge divides and can make a meaningful difference in people's lives. And so while we have a more definitive statement than we've had maybe ever in Nebraska on this particular topic in our most recent election, a lot of people have been saying, well, what do we do now? Well, what do we do now is exactly what we've been doing. If people care deeply about abortion access and abortion rights, they continue to engage with their government. They continue to speak out and organize peacefully. They help to support travel funds or legal defense funds for people who need care if they can't get it in their state. And they seek to continue to build towards the policy change they want to see in future years. And the same holds true on the other side. So a lot of those actions that we take beyond the ballot box are exactly the same that we need to apply today.
Okay.
And I'd add to that, on that topic in particular, the foster care system, improvements there, and making adoption, just not so expensive. It's so hard. But in general, to go back to the original question, I think where we can agree to disagree is in the amount of government in our lives, right? On one side, we see government as the answer, and on the other side, we see government as the problem. And I think that will, as you said, the red path and the blue path, I think that will continue to be the philosophies, and where the answer is always going to lie in the middle, and it's going to bounce back and forth in there. But I think that's where we're going to agree to disagree.
Laura?
So I think that on all of these issues where there's a lot of division, I think it's possible to come to some sort of agree to disagree notion. And the easiest way to do that, well, actually it's not easy, it's actually very hard, okay? But one of the things you have to do, you know, they always say that, you know, when you've got a finger pointing at somebody else, that means you've got, you know, 4 others pointing at yourself. I think it's important for all of us to consider, you know, going back to the authentically held beliefs, we all have to consider that, well, even though I feel this very authentically and very, you know, very passionately, I might be wrong. And if we can all consider, as we're talking to others, doesn't mean you have to change your mind, but it does mean, I think, that we need to consider the possibility that we're not right. And that makes it easier for us to say, well, right now, let's just agree to disagree.
All right. We have some questions in the audience, and I see one gentleman back here. So whoever has a mic that you can launch in his direction, that would be lovely. Right about in the middle. Put your hand up again, sir.
It seems to me that a lot of the red path and blue path is a result of our system of election, and the fact that we have primaries that are not open, and what's become kind of popular now, it seems, is ranked choice voting. And I'm interested in your thoughts on making some changes in the way we handle our elections.
The political science PhD.
I'll jump in there. Great question, thank you. And I love Jim's characterization, but as I'm looking, kind of doing some analysis on the most recent election results in Nebraska and beyond, I'm not seeing a red and a blue path, to be quite honest. When you see the amount of ticket splitting that we have in Nebraska, whether that's in the 2nd Congressional District or local leaders versus the presidential contest, when you look at the fact that President Trump carried our state handily, yet Nebraskans voted resoundingly in support of many progressive issues on the ballot initiative campaigns that were there. That actually shows me our community, our state, and our country are actually very, very closely divided and intertwined rather than on separate paths. So when you go to some of the mechanics of democracy, I think those have to be a part of the conversation. We have to figure out, are there tools in place that prevent more people from participating in our democracy, or that skew the types of candidates that can be successful in our democracy? And I think the answer is yes. When you look at gerrymandering, when you look at voter suppression, when you look at closed primaries, I think that those tools have a very significant impact. But when you look at what Nebraskans and what Americans are doing, they're actually turning away from both major political parties in a pretty significant and fast revolt, and moving to become independents as well, right? And so I think we need to recognize that amidst this political realignment and figure out ways to change or reform or update our tools of democracy to ensure that our circle is ever widened, to invite more people in to share their voice, rather than try to keep our fellow citizens who are otherwise eligible out.
Yeah, no, I think because the world is ever changing and evolving, those so-called tools of democracy have to be revisable. There have to be able to be amendments and a feedback loop around the Electoral College, around the issues of gerrymandering, and it probably needs to be done in times where there's less heat, because it'll always look like people are positioning for those changes around a particular election. But let me I feel like I saw something, and I'm speaking as a pastor now for sure. When Americans are trying to decide what candidate to vote for, there's a lot of calculus that goes into that. And I've talked with a lot of people, and you have to ask them about 20 questions to find out exactly what that calculus was. And as they come to that, it's a very introspective process. We don't talk to each other much about some of this. And that starts to focus upon oneself. And then there's something literally about the act of going and voting that when it comes to that moment, it's primarily driven by self-interest. And in fact, it's hard to imagine how your vote will affect people that are very different than you, because it's just by the very mechanism of the way we go about it. And just as a pastor, I feel like we lose empathy all the way along through that process. And so I would just like longer, deeper conversations before that divisive process begins.
Yeah, our founders warned us a long time ago about the two-party system and the problems that that would bring. And we see that, every election cycle. And I wish that there weren't the two parties that were the gatekeepers that controlled so much of what goes on in that political system, whether it's the dollars, who gets support, all those sorts of things. Because there's a lot of good people that I think could make good state senators and congressional, people and presidents, but they will never get that chance because they can't navigate the party system and they don't toe the line on the party line as they were expected to. I get asked all the time to run, and I'm like, I have no chance because I know, I would lose the evangelical support because of my position on gay marriage. I'd be gone. I would lose a lot on the left because of my position on taxes, and I would end up in this middle ground in no man's land that neither party would really want to support me, and there's just no way. And I'm sure there's people that are way more qualified than I would be to be a state senator or a congressional person or a U.S. senator, but they have to be able to navigate that system, and it's just not a system that I want to get into. I'll just say it that way. So I do wish it was different. I'm not sure how you overcome that, though. I wish I knew that answer, because if I did, I'd probably write a book and make a lot of money.
I think that's a really good question. And I think that there's a couple of things to consider. First of all, we've had essentially a two-party system forever, okay? And I think that goes back to, the early days when we have a single-member district, congressional districts. And so, what we always tell students is that, that the public in a democratically elected system, wants to get as close to a majority as they can, and so they sort of intuit this notion that it has to be either, team red or team blue. And as one who is neither team red or team blue at this point, I think that, I can appreciate the problems with ballot access and open primary, the need for, the desire for open primaries and all that sort of thing. I think the bigger problem, and I don't know exactly, I've got theories, but I don't know exactly where this began, is that the parties have not become a place where people can coalesce as grand coalitions, which is what we used to have, really. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when you had the liberal Republicans and the conservative Democrats in the South and things like that, and people could form coalitions, and you let people, the leadership let people vote the way they believed. I mean, for years we had, U.S. senators who were Democrats in Nebraska. Can you believe that? And governors. And so I think that that's something that we need to consider, that the part of the problem is just in the nature of parties themselves. But I don't know how you fix that. Maybe somebody else does, because what you're having now is people falling out of the party saying, nope, that's too far off to that side, or that's too far off to that side, and so they are becoming, independents or third parties that don't have the opportunity then to coalesce in a meaningful way. But
I just can't avoid putting in a little plug here. Joe mentioned that I've written about the Nebraska unicameral, and I want to encourage all of you to continue to support the unicameral as a nonpartisan, one-house body. I know that we all see, and we're right, that there is more partisanship in the unicameral than was true in the past, but it's still a far cry from what you see in traditional legislatures around the country and certainly in the Congress. Things happen here. People work across the non-existent aisle and so forth. So, and electoral changes are something that ought to be considered, I think. You know, the open primaries and the ranked choice voting. Things like that are much easier to change, I believe, than abolishing the Electoral College, which would be almost impossible. I think it's been tried 700 times.
Well, right, and when you think about it, Charlene, I mean, we essentially have open primaries for our legislative seats.
We do.
And
Yes.
so why not expand that? I mean, and school boards and all the other nonpartisan seats that we've got in Nebraska, you have open primaries. So why not expand that to other races as well?
I see a hand back here and one over here. So whoever you can get to first. Gentleman with the microphones? Yeah. Yeah, we're doing
Hello?
that.
Hi. Hello. I wanted to speak about, because a big emphasis is on bridging the partisan gap, and I, as a queer person, feel very strongly about that. I'm also very hesitant about it. One of the things that influences me when I look back in history is the Reagan administration's handling of the AIDS crisis, which, while there is a lot of conflict about how it's interpreted today, there were a lot of people in the administration who just wanted to let it happen to kill gay people. As a trans person and a person who has a lot of friends in this community, in Nebraska, when we're talking about bridging the partisan gap, usually one of the first people that's let go, one of the issues that's ignored, is minority issues, would be issues of queer people. And that's, frankly, I'm just not interested in bridging a partisan gap in that situation. That's a hesitancy I have in that conversation. I'm curious for you guys' thoughts. It just seems like there's some things that shouldn't be given up for the sake of that. Thank you.
I couldn't understand most of that. Thank you for that comment. I don't think there was a question that you'd like addressed particularly. Okay. There's another person with hand up, if you gentlemen could, or, okay.
Stand up. Certainly we look to our leaders for policy leadership. Is it past the time when we can look to our leaders as moral leaders as well?
Moral leaders. Moral leaders. What do you think?
Y'all looking at me? When Joe called me, he asked, "Why are you a Trump supporter?" And my first three, and you can remind me if I got this wrong, but my first three reasons were the economy and inflation, the role of government, and fixing that were primarily what I was looking at, because that's what affects me, that's what affects my family, that's what affects all my customers, that's what affects everybody around me in rural Nebraska. There are no perfect people. God tells us that, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? Yes. Yep. So when I look at who I'm voting for, I have that in mind, and that's what I think about, that there are no perfect people. No one comes close to the glory of God or the perfection of Christ, and I have to look past that, because that's apples to apples. Everything else that a candidate brings to the table, where they are in their policy positions, that's where they differ, and that's where I have to make my choice, because there are no perfectly moral people out there to choose from.
I'm less concerned about making a judgment about a particular human being than I'm worried about if there is a certain type of crassness or meanness, that it seems to give a social license to discriminatory talk and discriminatory behavior. So yeah.
We need a mic wherever you can find somebody there. We got lots of people who want to talk now, so.
Okay, returning to the issue of third parties and independent parties not being able to coalesce, I've heard suggestions that the ranked choice voting, which was mentioned over here, is one of the ways to do that, because people who have third parties or independent parties could vote for that person or interest first, and then vote second or third for somebody that they think will really win, so that they can express their interest. And if you have enough people who are expressing that interest, even if they don't win, you begin to see how many people are coalescing. My question for the panel is, I understand that ranked choice voting has been instituted in some cities and some other jurisdictions. Has it made a difference?
Has it what? What was the last question? Has it been?
Ranked choice voting, I understand, has been instituted in some cities and some jurisdictions, maybe even a state or two around the country. Has it made a difference in how
Alaska.
third parties and independent parties are reflected in those places?
Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in there a little bit. I mean, we do have some models and experiences from locals, and I think perhaps even some states may be moving that direction. But I think it matters. I'll give you a very lawyer answer, right? It depends, right? I think that it has had some impact in terms of moderating successful candidates, perhaps. I do think that it has also provided some results that perhaps were unintended or otherwise that are causing even proponents to maybe rethink that as a solution. It's very confusing for the electorate. It takes much, much longer to tabulate election results, and we know that the delay in reporting electoral results kind of feeds into a lot of additional concerns about election integrity and public confidence in our election systems. So we do see some of these great laboratories of democracy in local jurisdictions or our states kind of testing out these ideas. We've also started to see significant backlash in some of those jurisdictions to instituting that kind of reform. I personally think that open primaries and things of that nature are probably a better solution to move forward because it doesn't bring some of the same baggage that we're seeing with ranked choice voting. That's just kind of where I come down on it.
Yeah, I know that there are several organizations out there that have been working on electoral reforms, including ranked choice voting, and they're looking at different things. I think what some of them are looking at now, Alaska is one of the organizations, I think, that, or one of the states that did it and with some sort of marginal results in terms of being satisfactory. But I think that what a lot of organizations are kind of doing is going back to their fallback position for a while anyhow, and that would be the open primary system.
Either of you gentlemen? Okay, another question.
I was interested in Joe Starita's introduction, some references to the public square. A couple of questions. One, I think that elections are pretty important, but I also think that the day in, day out, week to week is as important. So one question is, where are the places and spaces where these sorts of discussions, looking for the public good, can happen? Where are our public squares these days? Which is kind of a cultural thing as much as it is political. Second question, how essential in your minds are local institutions to the future of our democracy? When I speak to local institutions, I'm talking about churches, talking about unions, talking about our unicameral, et cetera. How essential are those local institutions?
Okay. How many of you have Netflix at home? Okay. There's a great documentary right now that I caught last year when it was on a film festival thing, but it's called Join or Die. It is it's based on Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, who did Bowling Alone. Go watch that. If you haven't seen the documentary, it's an excellent documentary. And back in the day when Charlene and I were graduate students, I co-wrote a paper on the then new Bowling Alone back in the 1997 or 98 somewhere, and Putnam's thesis is that it's not hopeless. You know, we need to recapture this notion of social capital that we've lost. And so, to your question, go to your local coffee shop and sit around and talk with folks. Go to the Rotary Club. You know, all of these civic organizations. You know, he's got the data, which is impressive with Putnam. He's always got the data, and it shows that, you know, democracy is harmed the most when our social connectors fall apart. It's a lot harder for us it's a lot harder for us to hate our neighbor if we are working with them on the park cleanup or whatever.
I do think we're in a very dangerous moment around the type of suspicion we hold about institutions. And what's dangerous about this moment is institutions are being attacked by both far left and far right. And that's an interesting shared kind of attitude of destruction. On the far left, you have sort of Marxist theory and modern deconstructive theory saying that all this is just power moves. Anytime you see an institution doing something, it's just a power move, and try to look who's going to profit from that move. On the far right, you have this idea of just tear it all down, tear these institutions down. But what that doesn't recognize, the true conservative attitude is there's a lot of wisdom baked in these institutions over long periods of time. And if you just tear down these structures, you lose a lot of stuff you can't rebuild. So this is a dangerous moment around institutions, says the pastor of a church.
Brian, do you want to jump in, or you want the last word?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. It's good to see you. Thank you for your question. I think, number one, I'm really lucky just in terms of kind of my age, I guess. I am not super tech savvy. I don't spend a lot of time online and on social media. I just don't. I'm barely on Facebook to keep up with friends from high school and maybe some kid pictures or recipes, and I actually completely shut it off and took it off my phone the last couple of weeks because don't wear a watch. Yeah, and everybody knows me knows that. But I do think that social media, it has a powerful opportunity to amplify voices, to share information, to stay connected with people, but I also believe it has a very, very corrosive effect for our thinking and for our democracy. And I think that I've received so many panicked phone calls and texts and emails and seen so many frowns and furrowed brows from my neighbors over the last week, really, saying, Danielle, what do we do? How do we make it all right? Where do we go from here? And my advice in the short term is throw your phone away or unplug from social media. Eat good food, love your family, love your friends, love your neighbors, get exercise, get fresh air. Take care of yourself to be healthy for the challenges that we have ahead and to remember what's important beyond the election. And then also to make a difference. But democracy doesn't start and stop at the ballot box. We have an obligation to continually engage with each other, to hold elected leaders accountable, to put forward new ideas, to speak out when we agree or disagree with their proposals, to build for a future. And it's easy, I think, to be depressed when you're doom scrolling. I think it's harder to be depressed when you're of service to others in your community and when you're proximate. If you're upset about the results of the election, ask yourself, why? Is it because of reproductive rights? Is it because of LGBTQ rights? Is it because of economic justice? And find those local institutions that serve those purposes and go make a difference with neighbors in the community that you can make a difference on those issues with. So I think that those are some of the antidotes.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on the social media. We know very well now that those algorithms are built to feed you the worst of people who disagree with you, just nonstop, regardless of if it's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, whatever. Those are built to get the clicks, to build outrage, and that's just they're dangerous, honestly. As institutions, as platforms. I think the public square, to go, to hit that part of your question, which is a great question, by the way. We saw in this election cycle that podcasts, where we can sit down and have somebody that's running for office and have a full-blown 3-hour unedited conversation with them and get to the heart of what they really think, how they come to those positions, how they think about it, and why. And it's a way better format, I think, than what we've seen like with TV, where there's a 3-minute segment, a reporter's got 3 questions to ask or 3 points to prove. They get a politician in there, they hammer him for 3 minutes, and then they got to go to a break because their producer's, yelling at them. That's become a worthless medium by comparison to being able to sit down and really get to the heart of what somebody thinks. I would really, honestly, love to have seen the unedited, full-blown version of Kamala Harris's 60 Minutes interview, because there's so much controversy about the way it was edited. What did she say? What did she not say? What did she mean? What did she not mean? I don't know. But show the whole thing, or get on a podcast and talk through the subjects. And I think more and more, after what we've learned in this election cycle, that we'll see that, because those are the things we want to know. When we talk about bringing things out into the light, that full-blown three-hour unedited conversation, that brings it into the light. As far as institutions, yeah, I think all the institutions that have mattered in the past are going to continue to matter going forward, whether it's churches, charitable groups. You look at what happened in Western North Carolina. That was charitable organizations and citizen groups and people banding together that, came in and saved those people in those first couple of weeks after that hurricane went through there. That all those things will continue to matter, and I don't see them going away, and we can't disengage from them. I think we need to engage more with them as we see politics be ugly. I think those are where the light is, and those are where we need to go to.
So, I'm sorry, yes. All great stuff. And before we take more questions, so let me address this one to the panelists and the audience. What about respect? Can we agree to respect each other simply because we're all here on this earth together? Respect each other, not just tolerate, respect. At a human level, and maybe even beyond that? What do you people think? And how would that manifest itself, respecting each other?
I hope so. Yes. I think that we all have differences. I mean, I respect my husband, but I don't agree with him all the time. And I think that probably most people find that to be true of, their next door neighbors or their spouses or whoever. So, I think it's important for us to have a level of respect for everyone, again, for being here. And, yeah.
I do think there's a philosophy for our age. It's called personalism. And in that philosophical school of thought, the idea is the supreme value is the person, that a person has intrinsic worth and dignity. And that this philosophy looks for any way depersonalization is taking place. That is when a person is not seen as a full subject, they're an object to be manipulated or something to be used for some other means. And so this school of thought believes that when you encounter another human being, there needs to first and foremost be an act of extreme humility. That a person is an infinite subjectivity far beyond your grasp. and that you have to remain humble in the face of that mystery. But it holds the line on any moment that a person is just being used as a means to an end. They're an end themselves of intrinsic, infinite dignity and worth. And I think we saw in this election, there are a lot of people in America that feel like they've lost their dignity. We need to find a way to restore that.
Anybody else on the panel? How about out here? Okay, sorry. We're way up here in front. Can somebody bring a mic up here? Way up here.
Yes,
Can't.
me, but I feel like I need to speak out. My overriding, I may be a minority of one, but my overriding issue of the past several decades has been to phase out the Federal Reserve and its fiat currency and return to following the Constitution in monetary matters, which means using real money, gold and silver coin, not the counterfeit paper that's issued by the Federal Reserve.
Thank you for your opinion. Now we do have, we've had a lot from the back. Can we move our way up this way a little bit too, please?
I'm not sure I'm answering your specific question, but one of the things that I continue to be bothered by is the very words we use in any discussion. It's blue and red, it's black and white, and that's a very comfortable place to go, but it's not going to bring us together. I think the very words we use serve to divide us. And I think it's important that we stop and think about the words we're using and how do we bring people together, whether that's over a cup of coffee at a coffee shop or in a meeting, whether it's politics or work or whatever it might be. I really think the very words are very important.
Yeah, and I jump in. I really agree with you, and one of the reasons that I chose to re-enter public life at this very tumultuous time after being forced into constitutional retirement or term limited was because I was so concerned about the divisiveness and the acrimony in our public discourse. And I honestly believe it's another tool of political oppression and suppression, that the louder the voices are, that the more heated and pitched the rhetoric is, that the more dehumanizing the talking points become, no matter where they're emanating, on what point of the political spectrum, that gets us to stop seeing each other and listening to each other. And we can't even hear each other when we're at that pitched level. And so in order to help take down the temperature, it helps to also keep more people engaged. When things are so hot and so toxic, it's bad for democracy. People undervalue their vote. They undervalue their voice. They say, this isn't for me. I'm not going to run for office, even though I have good ideas and I might be able to be a good problem solver. And I think as much as gerrymandering or disenfranchisement, I think that's an actual tool of voter suppression. And I think it frays our social bonds and connections, which we need in community and which are intrinsic to our democracy. So we can debate different ideas and have sharp disagreements about the solutions or the priorities, but we do have to be careful about the words. And whether it's a politician in the White House or on the local city council, if they're utilizing rhetoric that dehumanizes their neighbor, it's our choice every day to decide whether or not to adopt that or to speak out forcefully against that.
Yeah. And it goes back to that respect piece you were talking about, Charlene, in the previous question. Yeah, we just got to stop calling each other names. You know, I used red path, blue path, I think just as a matter of simplicity in the discussion. And yeah, there's got to be a better way to do that too, right? But you're right. It does nobody any good to call each other the names that we've all endured and witnessed and heard through the course of this election cycle. It got us nowhere. I don't know that it convinced or changed anybody on their vote. And it does disengage people from politics. There are a lot of people I know that don't even want to talk about politics at all because it's that. Even if they were discussing, even if there's just a group of friends who probably all believe the same way, they don't want to talk about it because there's so much of that. Even though it might not be a part of their conversation, there's so much of that name calling and the words that they just don't even want to entertain it. They'd rather talk about Nebraska football losing again than deal with that, because it has become that ugly. And I think if we all make a very strong effort on this next election cycle to not do that, I think it would go a long way to go into the right path.
Great. I just want to point out that I'm wearing purple on purpose. We have one question over here. Yeah.
I would love to engage with people with varying viewpoints. But the thing that I have difficulty with is that there is no foundation of truth to engage with. And I would love for people of both sides to agree on common truths so that we can have true engagement. And I think that one common truth that we did not agree on this election cycle is that this was not an election about blue or red, conservative or liberal. It was an election about democracy or fascism. And I think that if we had voted on that, we would have had a different outcome. Because my fear is that we have created a condition that we may not be able to come back from, or it may take us years to come back from. And so, like I said, I don't think that we as a people have difficulty with communicating with each other. As long as we know what each word means that we're communicating about, I think we can communicate very effectively.
Thank you.
I was on some website the other day, and somebody was talking about how in the last 20 years, every election had been represented to them as the most consequential election of their lifetime. And I mean, I suppose that's true at some level. I mean, every election is very consequential. I don't hold the level of cynicism or concern that some do, while still being concerned. And I think that it's important for us to move on. And I'll just drag us back to social capital for a minute. I mean, I think it's really important for us to engage locally and find the things that we agree with our neighbors on, or with members of our organization, or whatever, or our church. I think that it's critical that we not give up, and no matter what's happening in Washington D.C., I think that we can, we in Nebraska can do it right.
I find your comment very interesting. I appreciate it. Thank you. Because I know a lot of people on the right who would say they agree, but that the fascism was on the left, right? When they look at policies that were proposed by Kamala Harris and that we've endured through the COVID years and for the last 4 years, people on the right would say the same thing. And I think it comes back to that, what terms are we going to use to describe how we disagree with each other? Because when you go to the fascism term, that's very offensive, right? And it throws up a red flag to make me go, I don't want to listen. For a lot of people, not for me. I'll engage with anybody. I don't care. I got a lot of friends on the left. I just spent a whole weekend in the Black Hills with 3 liberal friends, right? But I think that goes back to when we start throwing around those terms, fascist and Nazi and those sorts of things, I think we better be really careful, because that is part of this thing that heats up the cauldron, and it's not a good thing.
To be fair, let's look at it the other side too, because we had plenty of people being called socialists and communists and that sort of thing. So all of those things are they're hot button issues. They're hot button terms that tend to throw up flags and make everybody more defensive.
That's why I said when we start using those names, we just need to stop.
Not respectful, is it? Right. Okay, there's all kinds of hands up. Go back there, somebody.
Hello? I would say, first of all, if the shoe fits, wear it. So I think that one of the things that I would like to ask the panel is the country has just elected a man who has done almost everything that people up there have talked about as being offensive, immoral, on and on and on. How low do we have to go in not requiring morality from our elected officials? He has called 10 million, he's called 10 million people animals. He has called for the execution of generals. He has, I mean, you go on and on. He has, in his first term, he lied over 30,000 times. Where do we stop with this, and why? The second time around, would the population vote for a man so obviously unfit for the office, regardless of what he thinks about economics or government or anything else? You know, he is who he is, and that counts. And it seems like, you know, the elephant in the room is not being addressed. How did this happen?
So this is where Charlene and Joe aren't going to like me very much. But I think we have a problem in our national news media in what they portray, parts of what they portray. I think they've done us a disservice for 20, 30 years at least. So I think some of what you hear is maybe not 100% accurate. And two, let's not forget.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Please, come on.
And
We're going to
don't
be
forget,
respectful.
you know, that our own president, sitting president, called those of us who support Donald Trump garbage, right? We've been called garbage, trash, bitter clingers, deplorable, fascist, Nazis. Again, it works both ways, and neither way is good. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere at all if we aren't willing to look at ourselves in the mirror and go, this isn't right. I noted earlier that I use the term red path, blue path, and it's part of that language that maybe isn't really constructive, and we've got to find a different way to talk about differences, because it comes down to political differences. And you have to remember that, and Danielle, you've studied how the election results went. There were a lot of Democrats and independents that voted for Donald Trump. You had Muslims, Catholics, Jews, Amish. You had all these different groups, and I hate the fact that we get balkanized by the press and the pundits into all these different groups. I really dislike that a lot. But you had a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life and backgrounds and income levels and races move to vote for him. So they simply disagree with you. And that's all. It's not personal. They just disagree with you, period.
I would like to suggest, too, that one can think one thing about the leader without attributing that to everybody who voted for him. That's not necessarily, people aren't one-dimensional, by and large.
I think that's right. And, you know, a lot of us are searching in the wake of the election to try and figure out, how did this happen? What went wrong if our candidate lost, much as the other team was after the last go-around, right? To try and do a postmortem for learning, for kind of strategizing and rebuilding. And I don't think the answer is singular. I think that it's very complex and layered. You can look at issues related to racism, to sexism, to tools of oppression within our democracy itself, right? But also, I think a key takeaway that it would be foolish not to hear and embrace and lean into is that there's many of our neighbors in Nebraska and across the United States that the status quo is not working for. It's not working for them. And I've talked to a lot of voters who are strong supporters of President Trump. And they're drawn to the disruption of the status quo, and they're looking for a better path. And I can tell you, talking to my neighbors in North Lincoln, knocking on their doors, hearing about the challenges that they have, they're working. Nebraska has the highest percentage in the country of the number of adults working full-time, year-round, and living in poverty. They're working their tails off. They're trying to struggle with inflation, with childcare, with a loss of a social safety net or a benefit or a good job that used to be able to take care of a family when you played by the rules and did everything right. And they're frustrated, and they're looking for alternatives to the status quo, which is not working, for a lot of different reasons. And I actually find a lot of hope in that part of the message, because I think there's a ton of common ground on economic justice issues for working families. I don't know if he'll be able to pull it off or how we'll pay for it from a fiscal perspective, but you want to end taxes on tips and overtime? Sign me up. You want to extend the child tax credit, which has been the most important anti-poverty tool our country has seen in modern history? Fantastic. Now, we can argue about the inequities and the fiscal responsibility of some other aspects of the tax plan, but it's not all bad or it's not all good. And while it is multi-layered, there are important lessons that we on the left need to be open to hearing as well, so that we can figure out how to help neighbors in need, how to find common ground, and how to move forward.
Okay. Okay, right here, and then we'll go back there.
I'm hearing three overarching themes. I'm hearing people who are responding to specific changes that they would like to see that may be helpful. And I'm also hearing we need to find a way and some forums and places where we can get together. But one of the things also that's come up is we have our own biases, and we hear things as truth or not truth, and we have inside of us our own polarization. And so becoming more mindful and aware of what our triggers are is important for us at this time to move forward. So in our community, we have some resources that are available. There's a nonpartisan movement in Lincoln. In its third year. It's called Justice in Action. And you're not a red or a blue, but you're working on systemic change in 3 areas in Lincoln: in mental health, in criminal justice, and in affordable housing. There is, on Tuesday night, for those who haven't known about this, a community problems assembly. It's at 6:30 at Christ United Methodist. I invite everyone to come. The other thing that is, it's a national movement. It's called Braver Angels. And it came up after Trump was elected in 2016 and the division in the country became so apparent. So this is like, and I'm feeling like, a person who's been involved in affecting change for over 50 years. I feel like I've just found that my husband has been cheating on me all these years. I didn't realize there was such deep discontent. I feel blindsided. So Braver Angels has red-blue workshops where reds and blues and independents talk across party lines. They also have one that's called Depolarizing Within, where we start to identify in ourselves what are some trigger words? What do we react to when we feel like calling somebody else stupid or uninformed? Or, well, that's totally a lie. Well, okay, go under that. Seek to understand. Now, is there anybody else here who knows about Braver Angels besides my daughter? Okay, and you guys? Yeah? Okay. So we have some people here who, let's get together, we can do these depolarizing within workshops. And you hold those, because I'm one, my daughter is, you guys, are you aware of it at least? Yeah? The Bartles. Yeah. And we could have small home meetings, or we could have small coffee shop meetings, or a Zoom, if you don't want to be in the same room or can't get there. So those are things we can do that. Contact us afterwards. It's like an hour and a half, but we start to become more mindful of what's going on for ourselves. Why we ourselves, what our experience is saying that makes us shut somebody else down or makes us stop listening. Because we've got to get to somebody else's lived experience before we can really accept that. And it's not seeking to change their mind, it's seeking to understand.
Thank you so much. The lady back here who's had your hand up for about 20 minutes, stand up, please. Yeah, you, in the scarf. Stand up.
As I've listened to everybody, I think I've narrowed this down to 3 points to make us go forward, not argue about the past. The first is that we need to have facts that are truth. So if we're talking about economy, if we talk about people, we need to know the truth and not what someone says that is not the truth. The second thing we need is civility. Civility means you're not calling people names, you're not being mad at somebody who votes differently than you are, you treat them like the respect. And the third, I can count, the third one is kindness. Because even within my family, we have Republicans and we have Democrats, but we've all been kind. You know, they can disagree with me. So we need truth, we need civility, and we need kindness. And we can go forward.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we are losing people rapidly. So one more comment from the lady on the aisle here, and then I think we'll put an end to it.
No, it never is. Here.
Thank you. One of the things that has not really been addressed, if we take a look around the crowd, we're a lot of gray hairs here. And so our institutions and what we look at as far as getting organized are different than the young people. And we have a lot of young people who did get involved this time, and that's great. But we can talk about the topics we've talked about, but they're different in direction for the younger people. And those are the ones we need to be working with. We all had somewhat of the same background when we took history and geography and civics, and that's not been the case recently, I don't believe, for the young people. So what do we do about that? Because it is going to be a major issue. And we haven't talked about money either, but I want to hear about the young people first.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to wrap up with your most burning thoughts that you want to convey in 60 seconds or less.
Conversation, and that applies to young people, that applies to those who disagree with you, and that means listening as well as talking.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about where we go together after a challenging election this week for me, and the values that I hold dear on the national level and even on the state level. And I've been thinking about how, like life, democracy is messy and also beautiful. And I wouldn't trade it for any other system in the world. And we have seen, and we have experienced, and we have lived through times of great political turmoil in our past, in our history. We know that. Perhaps some is as pitched as it might be feeling today. And we have to figure out what's really important to us, what's really driving that concern, what's really driving that grief right? Is it a particular issue that you're most concerned about? Is it democracy as a whole? Is it fear for your family? Is it fear for your marriage, which I know is a real thing that people are talking about right now in the wake of this election?
Wrap it up, Danielle.
Yep, figuring out what that is, and then once you take care of yourself, pouring in to continue to make a difference, because ultimately you can't beat people who don't quit, and that's people who continue to show up and fight for what they believe, and that's what I'm going to do.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I just appreciate what we experienced and modeled. Vivid disagreement, to be sure, but a type of sincerity and good intention and civility. But it also occurs to me, my final word, this is ironic, but I actually end religious service with these words, and I just realized they fly way beyond religion. Every service I end by saying this: hold fast to what is good. Return no one evil for evil. Find your joy in serving others.
I hold fast to what I said earlier, that I believe people are just good people. I think there's a lot of good in everyone. And like any relationship, we have to keep talking about it, because if we stay balkanized, if we stay as disparate groups, it's only going to get worse. So I got to go with the teacher on the truth and the civility and the kindness, and continue on with that. We might disagree, and that's okay. I don't take it personal. But if we stick to those things, I think we're going to be all right.
Thank you all for coming. We started with some words from Abraham Lincoln today, and I want to end with just a few more, just a couple more. In his second inaugural address, President Lincoln talked about healing a nation that had gone to war with itself over polarizing issues. On March 4th, 1865, he concluded his speech with these words: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Thanks for coming.